Hello, and welcome to another edition of Here We Are. I'm your host, T.R. Mugabe. When Richard Allen walked up out of that white racist church in Philadelphia to start up a church in the United States for Africans, the church has played a vital role to the black community. Not only is the church a place for socializing, it is also a place to receive education and organizing. Does the church play that same role today? We'll find that out from our guest. My first guest is Reverend Al Sampson. He is pastor over at the Fernwood United Methodist Church in Chicago. My next guest is Reverend Dr. Benjamin Alexander Leon, and he is presently the interim pastor at Mount Calvary Baptist Church in Chicago. I'd like to thank you both for coming to our program. So good to have you here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
The first question is, what is the role of the African church to the African community, in the African community?
We have always felt that there are three types of churches within the black community. One is called the entertainment church, where we jump up and down with the Holy Ghost on Sunday, and the people live with Casper the Ghost on Monday. The second church is called the containment church, where you have the intelligentsia, what they call the talented tenth. There's a group of churches in this town with nothing but school teachers, but there's no African-centered curriculum on Sunday, and no African-centered curriculum during the week. There's a church in this town with a whole lot of black judges and no Thurgood Marshall legal clinic. So the second church is the containment church. Then the third church is what we call the Church of Liberation, because it has a job description found in Isaiah 61, which simply said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon us, and it has anointed us to preach the gospel, give sight to the blind, heal the sick, clothe the naked, feed the hungry." And it actually lays out a total job description of what the church is supposed to be about, which is what we call the Church of Liberation. So the main thrust of the churches that follow the dictates of the Scripture is a church of liberation. And when you go into the community, you'll find that there are three types of churches occurring inside our community.
Now I'm going to ask the same question to you, Dr. Leon, and then I'm going to go back to you and I'm going to ask you, do you feel that it's important that all those three type churches, I mean, is it important that you have all three of those churches in the community? But I want you to think about that, and I want Dr. Leon to answer the first question about the role of the church in the black community.
Well, I think the role of the black church in the Afro-American community is essentially what it has always been. The black church has stood historically at the nexus of the dialectic tensions in the black community. It is a kind of a nucleus where all of these tensions occur. For example, the tension between the rich and the poor, the tension between the intelligentsia and the not so educated, the tension between families that are the model families and single parent homes and so on, the tension between the prophetic and the priestly, the tension, like Pastor Sampson quite appropriately pointed, between the sensational, the highly emotional church and the more elite or educated community. I think the black church has been the broker, so to say, of these dialectic tensions for the history of the black community, and has, to a large extent, pointed the way towards what he described as the Church of Black Liberation, which I think is a growing consciousness within the black community at this time.
Now, when you were talking, you had broken down to like three different types of churches. Would you say that all these are necessary in the black community? Are you saying that's the way it's divided?
Yeah, I'm saying that's the way it's divided, and it's divided based on the kind of comfortability. When you look at the entertainment church, it's okay to entertain, is what that church is saying, but we don't have to be responsible for your needs on Monday through Saturday, where you can come on Sunday and get the Holy Ghost, but your people can still live with Casper the Ghost on Sunday on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The containment church is people who went out and got an education based on the sacrifices of their loved ones, vis-a-vis their mother, their grandmother, whatever. And when they came back, they only work Monday through Saturday to get their own paycheck, but they don't work for the liberation of their people, because only if you pay me will I put together an African-centered curriculum within my church to teach Sunday school on one hand from an African perspective, because the Bible is an African document. And on the other hand, during the week, I'm not going to volunteer my time because I'm not getting paid, even though I'm the talented 10th, even though sacrifices was made for me to go get an education and bring it back to my community. I work for the Board of Education, so that's enough. And I'm not coming in the middle of the week and establish an African-centered curriculum, even though I have the capacity working for the Board of Education as a curriculum specialist. The Church of Liberation says that to participate within this type of a congregation, you must use your skills, not only for your own personal sustenance, but also for the community and the kind of needs that occur within the community for liberation. Because the purpose of the African American church in America is to continue the liberation struggle that people like Richard Allen, people like Frederick Douglass and Marcus Garvey and Martin King came through that whole process. We must continue the race and pass the baton on to our young people and our future generations yet unborn.
You wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, I want to make a comment about this because it strikes me as important, especially this emphasis on liberation. I think the liberation emphasis properly holds in creative balance, creative tension, the polarities that exist within the black community, and that is an attempt to do that. These churches that opt for one pole, for example, the intelligentsia, or the churches that opt for a highly emotional experience, are churches that have lost the creative balance that is actually part of the black system living. Black people are not simply emotional, they are not merely intellectual. Black people are the mixture of all of these tensions, and the quest towards a liberating community is a quest that holds in balance these tensions and deals with them realistically.
Because the church was not born out of entertainment. It was not born out of some pseudo-European intellectualism. The church was born as a liberation tool to preserve what our ancestors brought over here in the pattern and the pathology of slavery on one hand, and at the same time be able to do institutional building. So when you look at the 43 black schools through the United Negro College Fund apparatus, all of those came out of church communities. And southern-based and urban-based churches are still supporting that type of tradition. When you look at people, whether it's George Washington Carver or Mary McLeod Bethune or Fannie Lou Hamer, all of them gave birth through leadership in the church. Aretha Franklin could not sing like she sings if she hadn't come out of her daddy's church in Detroit. You see what I'm saying?
And in addition to that, I would venture to say, wouldn't you, Reverend, that to opt for one pole to the exclusion of the other is to run the risk of a kind of neo-slavism, a kind of neo-oppression, if you would, because it really distorts the true picture of the emerging black selfhood.
Yeah, and that's why the Bible takes us, for example, to Psalm 137:4. How can you sing a song in a strange land? I mean, why go downtown and sing downtown for Mayor Daley's Gospel Fest?
Black or African?
Yeah, go down there and sing.
Chorus groups do that.
Yeah, when they haven't registered to vote, when the church doesn't have an economic solution for our young people who are in pain. And so who are you singing for? When our songs are songs of liberation. When we used to sing the songs, I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes, that was our people in the South who was sending the signal to the North that when you come north, get you some shoes because Chicago was cold. And so you have to put shoes. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was not just a song. There was a boy who was assigned to put his ear to the railroad track, and he would be able to know that the train was coming. And so he would start singing the song, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. So to go downtown and just sing like some little pickaninnies singing for Martha Daly is putting the black church in a compromising position when the fact of the matter is our songs grow out of our struggle. And when you stop struggling, you end up getting secure, you end up getting comfortable, and then you don't want to put up the risk, and then you do with what happens lots of times in the black church. It's called the denial. Then you start denying. And when you start denying who you are and whose you are, and you move off into entertainment, or you hide your frustrations under intellectualism, then you never move to the level of liberation.
I think one thing that has, and I would ask if you would agree or not, would have to do with the assimilating, as far as blacks being able to assimilate into this culture. I think that would be one reason, or one problem, or one consequence of that. But what I want to ask now is that we had talked about it before the show, but we were talking about how the church was the nucleus, and still is considered the nucleus of the black community. There was a certain level of social cohesiveness we had within the church. Do you feel that we're losing that? I mean, from what you're saying, it seems like it's kind of stripping away at that. And then if you feel that way, then outside of what you just said, what other problems do you see would be connected with that, or or as reasonings as to why that's happening?
I want to respond to that simply because I want to provoke Pastor Sampson to a further commentary. I think a large part of what is happening in the black community has to do with role modeling, has to do with leadership styles. There are a number of black leaders and black pastors that have opted for certain kinds of styles. Many of these leadership models are models that are bought from the larger society, from the society at large, but are not really indigenous or endemic to the black soul. And as a result of that, we find churches practicing worship styles, the consequence of leadership models that are not really commensurate with black vision nor indigenous to black soul. Yes, it is true that we are creatures of the song and the dance and the rhythm, but that's not all we are. And so in terms of the cohesiveness of the black community, I think black leaders need to engage in dialogue. I think a forum like this is indicative of the kinds of things that needs to be happening in the black community among black leaders, among black churchmen, on a larger scale. What would you say, Ray?
Well, yeah, I think that the question of role modeling is important. The beauty of the black church is that you can develop young leadership. In my church, last Sunday, my Sunday school teacher was not able to attend, and I put the young brother in charge of the Sunday school. And I gave each one of them assignments. Next Sunday, you're going to be the leader of the Sunday school. Well, what are we doing? We're now developing leadership among a young boy who's 8, 9, 10, 12 years of age. When he comes before the church on an Easter Sunday or Children's Day and starts articulating, and the teacher says, hold your head up, don't talk with your head down, you're now developing what it means to be a leader. When he sees my involvement out in the community, he can say that's his pastor as quick as he can say that's Michael Jordan. And that's why it's important for the black preacher and the black church to understand that we are in a struggle. Because if we don't show that to our young people from a mentoring point of view, they will assume that you don't have to be a warrior in America. that you can just go on and get you a BMW, get an education, and that would be the end of your life, and move out to Country Club Hills and live happily ever after, until your son ends up in conflict with a system out there in Country Club Hills that has not accepted you, or until your daddy doesn't get allowed to play golf at Country Club Hills, and you take a pass on that and go to church and sing Jesus paid it all to him I owe, or have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. When the fact of the matter is, how do we move to make that golf course accountable to the black community as well as to the rest of the community? So we can never be comfortable. The other side of the coin is that we must see ourselves as a church to lay out the vision for what a city should be, what a state should be, and what a country should be. Too many times the black church feels that it's impotent, that it can't make social change. And the whole life of my involvement with Martin King showed and proved that grassroots people can make a decision and make a difference in this country that will have a rippling effect across the world. When they had in Europe the Berlin Wall, they sung a song of our ancestors, "We Shall Overcome," was done by a black preacher. The song was written by a black preacher, Reverend Tindley. And the interesting story about him, he wrote that song, but he also wrote another song called "Leave It There." But he started out as a slave, then he was an orphan, he was the janitor of the church, and then he ended up being the pastor of the church that he was the janitor of, that had over 12,000 people in the church. So we get now the song "We Shall Overcome" being sung in Europe, but it started out with the mind and the psyche and the cultural milieu of a slave, an orphan, a janitor, a preacher.
Yes, this doesn't only speak to the matter of cohesiveness, but it also speaks to the matter of continuity. Your comment there it's clear to me, at least, that we need to indigenize the dream or the vision. And to do that, I remember as a child, we would gather together in the village to hear the village fathers. My father was a village father, and he told the story of the land and the people and the tribes. And I learned the story, and my brother knew the story, and the story was told and retold. Now, when you have churches that practice a leadership model where there is no continuity or indigenization of the dream, the vision is only stuck with the pastor.
That's right.
The vision is only stuck with the board. And no younger people, younger minds are being trained. Younger people are seen as a threat to the establishment, which is a leadership model that is co-opted from the society at large. All the presidents in this country have been very old men. Very, very old men, none of them black and none of them female, no women. So if we are not careful, black churches are constantly buying into a leadership model which is ostracizing their young people, and there is no indigenization or continuity of the vision. Nobody after this generation would sing the songs. I like the opera house, but I long for the beat of the drums.
And the interesting reason why that's important is M.C. Hammer really understands that he has to come back to his roots, and so he sings religious songs. Preachers have a responsibility to preach sermons around the principle that I'm too legit to quit because of the struggles that we go through as a race of people in a society that will not hear us lots of times. The other thing you have to remember is that the black church is not a neighborhood church. The black church is an international church with an international agenda. There are rootages, there are basic fundamental things that we do in our order of worship and in our relationships, that the same thing occurs with the brothers and sisters in the Caribbean and the brothers and sisters in Africa. A lot of people don't realize the beauty of a man like J.H. Jackson, Yes, on one hand, he was declared a dictator. Yes, on one hand, he kept the process locked up and locked down. But on the other hand, he understood, because they had in Africa they had land. The AME Church, right to this day, owns land in Africa. A lot of African-based churches in America still have roots and relationships in Africa, so, and the Caribbean. So it's not just a church on 47th Street, a church on 119th or 101st. We have linkages back to the homeland, because when we got over here, we took our church with us. When you read Benjamin Mays' book, who was the president of Morehouse College, who was the mentor of Martin King, The Negro's God, he roots himself back into the church. When you read Miles Mark Fisher's Negro Slave Songs in the United States, where when we talked about heaven, it wasn't a geographical location. We knew that America was hell and that Africa was heaven, because it was the land of milk and honey. When we talked about Jerusalem and going to Zion, beautiful Zion, we wasn't talking about going up in the sky. That's white folks' public relations. The fact of the matter is, we were sending a signal back to the memories of our ancestors of how beautiful Africa was and how beautiful the Caribbean was. And if you've ever been to any of those places, you know that that is the land of milk and honey.
We have a linkage here. Dr. Leon is Guyanese. And I know that you probably, when he was talking, you probably wanted to speak upon your growing up there, and I guess the type of religion you had there and things of that nature.
I suppose one of the great tragedies that has been perpetrated across the world and still continues to live is the suspicion and distrust that has been sown among international black people. I've had the horrible experience of being told that in America, for example, black people were taught that other black people in other parts of the world felt superior to them. In some cases, I was told. I was also told that they felt inferior to them. This is all part of the 1712 speech by Willie Lynch that is continuing to live across the world, where if you pit black people against each other, we will continue to remain suspicious of one another. The truth of the matter is, when I came to the States, the same songs that are sung in the churches here were sung at home. While you were laboring on the cotton fields, we were laboring on the sugar plantations. And when you were singing "Steal Away to Jesus," we were singing "I Ain't Got Long to Stay Here." And so there are really these distinctions that are made are really artificial distinctions.
And T.R., let me put this in kind of a focus for our listening audience. See, there's a thing what they call historical religions and traditional religion. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are what they call historical religions, because they all have a mom and daddy, they all have a book, and they were all born in a particular moment in time. So Jesus was born 2,000 years ago in an African country, Northeast Africa, Bethlehem of Judea. And then he went to Egypt, which is around the corner. Muhammad was born in what now they call Middle East, is really Northeast Africa. And Moses was born in Egypt. So all of that centered around Africa. That's called historical religions. But what we had as Africans in Africa was traditional religion. It doesn't have no mom and daddy. It has no book. And it's traditional because it gets hand-me-down, like he pointed out. The best example is Alex Haley's Roots. Yes. It wasn't until it got to Alex that he ended up putting in a book. Up until that time, it was oral tradition. So on Sunday morning, we have Catholic Cadillacs, we have Methodist Mercedes and Muslims, and we have Baptist Buicks, and we have Presbyterian Pontiacs, and we ride to our little pieces of real estate called House of Worship. But when we get out of those cars, of all of those various denominations, we're Africans in America. And so the church becomes that instrument of social change because it's the only place that we can exchange our European Americanism for what does it mean to be African, what does it mean to be in a liberation struggle, and what does it mean to have a vision for our people to take our folks somewhere. For Good Friday service, I preached a sermon where Jesus was on the cross, and traditionally he says to his mother, "Behold John, your son, and son, behold your mama." Well, it became new, fresh information when I gave the point about it being a single parent, because we've never looked at the Bible with Jesus' dialogue with his mother and John as him blessing a single parent relationship. Because now we find within our community a whole market now of single parents. How do we handle that? Years ago, if you were a single parent, you'd get put out of the black church. You couldn't come to the black church pregnant. You couldn't get your child christened. Now we say that it's important to christen the child, save the mother, and find out who the son is, the daddy is, and go rescue the daddy and bring him in. But that social policy of if you're on welfare, you can't live with your man, that one policy disrupts the family. So you get the mentality of a Dan Quayle jumping on a Murphy Brown about being a single parent, when the fact of the matter is governmental policy says that a father can't live and receive the public welfare. So the church has to provide the vision and the direction of where society should go. It's very important.
What is the responsibility of a member to his church? We've spoken about the responsibility of the leaders of the church, what they have to the community. What is the member's responsibility to a church?
They have the same job description that I argue is found in Isaiah 61. In our church, we teach our people to tithe, but we also ask them to tithe at the grocery store. So just don't tithe your salary. When you go to the grocery store, tithe on the food. If you buy $100 worth of food, bring 10% of that food to the church where we have a big basket. Why is that important? 2 weeks ago, a lady called me crying on the phone. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. She went around the churches in the neighborhood, and they didn't have any food. It was no problem for her to come to my church on Sunday morning and get all the food that she wanted, because we had a congregation that was sensitive to follow the leader and tithe, because you just can't tithe your money, okay? Because the money goes in the general fund. Tithe your food. And what does that mean? That you now are feeding the hungry, because the scripture is going to ultimately apply to everybody. Yes. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? You know, when I was in prison,
did you visit me? Did
you visit me? And that's not only 26 in California. A group of us have been arguing, for example, that there are 5,000 young black males at 26 in California. 5 blocks down the street on 31st in Kedzie sits Washburn Trade School with 3,000 empty seats. Come September, we're going to put 3,000 young unemployed black males at Washburn Trade School and get them into the construction industry. Why? I can't say, suffer little children come unto me and forbid them not, for such is the kingdom of God, and try to obey the scripture about being in prison and you didn't visit me, when I don't visit that young unemployed black male and make sure that he gets a job so that he doesn't land at 26th in California and be 5,000 number one. Okay, we find that young people who run off to school and get masters in business administration try to hustle up to be a part of the Fortune 500, and they get the misfortune and have no fortune as the Fortune 501, when they can turn back around and work with us, with the black farmers down south. My church is the only church in the country that has a Department of Agriculture within my church, because we're trying to work with black farmers, because by the year 2000, there'll be no more farmers and there'll be no more land within the black community if we don't develop a marketing program. In this town right now, TR, one white man controls all the sweet potatoes. The Greeks control the collard greens. And yet we got black farmers down south who plow their vegetables under because they don't get access to the marketplace. Yet we have people who sit up in churches from Mississippi, from Alabama, who go to family home for family reunions, and they'll fill up their trunk, but they won't bring it up every week and set it out there on the parking lot on a Saturday for their churches. Yet everybody runs home down south for the family reunion.
You know, it's very interesting. Okay, well, did you want to?
Just to offer a balancing commentary here, TR, to Pastor Sampson's comment, which focuses on the social action aspect of your question. What are members to do? I think all persons who are members of the church, who are part of the church, whether you're in a leadership capacity or not, is a member of God's church. And in that sense, all of us have a similar mandate. I simply want to call attention to the mandate of the Christian lifestyle. I think whether you're a leader or an ordinary member of a Christian community, all of us are called upon to model a lifestyle after the lifestyle of Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord, and to translate that commitment then into concrete action programs for the benefit of the building of the black community. One without the other would not do. To talk in terms of social action programs without a commitment to moral integrity will not work. To talk in terms of a commitment to moral integrity and a Christian lifestyle while people go hungry will not work. I think these two dimensions of the struggle, and I like the word struggle that the pastor used earlier, has to be held in creative balance. It is not an either or, it is a both and. And I simply want to add this balancing comment to the absolute importance of black men and women getting saved, living godly, staying off of drugs, avoiding unwanted pregnancies, and etc., and taking some responsibility.
So you can't be chairman of the choir committee and live common law and going into your third child, and you and the pastor become in a tense situation when he approaches you about marrying.
Or being a deacon and shacking up.
Yeah, I mean, because what you want to be able to do is remove your religion out of your personal and put it into action. Because sometimes we'll be like the story of the Good Samaritan, where we just be religious and pass by the folk who are in the street. When what makes Jesus so important as an African prophet that comes from Africa, who we need to see Jesus as black, because he comes from that whole part of the country, and he's a part of our theological understanding, is that he was a man of action. And he asked you to come out of your own personal self and start living for other people, because you can't spell the word church without you, and you can't spell the word community without you and I. And it's under that kind of aegis that we have the responsibility. There is no distinction when it comes to the job description between the member and the pew. Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's. Everybody needs to register and vote. Everybody needs to within each church needs to have a voter education program so that people can know how valuable their vote is in relationship to the impact it has on governmental funding. Everybody needs to understand that within our community we have a $300 billion economy, which is a blessing that God has given us. We've got 25 Caribbean nations, which is another blessing, 50 African nations, that we ought to participate in cooperative economics. That churches who cook dinner on Sunday morning ought to find black distributors rather than just taking their money up to Jewel Food or up to Dominic or over to the Arab store. because the Arabs would be glad to give you collard greens and pork to put in the collard greens, knowing they don't eat pork themselves because of their religion. But they don't have no problem feeding it to you. So the church has got to be the visionary, and it's got to provide the action. You can't talk about, in my father's house are many mansions, and you ain't building no homes, and you're not doing any rehabilitation. And it doesn't make any sense for the chairman of the deacon board to be a plumber, and he hasn't taught 10 young men how to be a plumber, because they've taken it kind of out to scripture. But Jesus' father was a carpenter, and Jesus was a carpenter. He could build lives because he could build homes. And what we need to understand is that when you sit in church, we ought to have a skills bank on what skills are in the church. So if there's 5 teachers and you've got 100 young people, how do you match those 5 teachers to put together an African-centered curriculum so that those children will have a cultural identity? And how do those children with their bad grades get a marriage going on between the teacher and... Now, why is that important? If you don't train that child, and if you don't come up and spend 5 more minutes during the week in Sunday school as a Sunday school teacher, and during the week, once a week as a tutor, you might find that child in your classroom 7 years later, charge of a gang, and he'll hit you in the head because you didn't become accountable to him when you was in the church, because you drove him out the church because you gave him no program of accountability.
You wanted to say something before you said that. I wanted to make this comment that a lot of people don't realize it, but the church, just like any other corporation, it's a business. And it's run, I mean, a good church, I should say, is run like a well-run business. But I wanted to say that before you had made your comment, Dr. Leon.
Oh, I was simply wanting to observe that between a vision and action is a whole educational process that needs to be undertaken. And this is what I think Pastor Sampson is pointing to quite properly, that black churches need to return, need a homecoming, a return to that place of training, of storytelling, and storytelling relevant and commensurate with the challenges of these times, not just the historical story of where we've come from, but the story, to translate that story in terms of facing the challenges of these times and to recreate it, as it were, the story for the future. And this is a whole educational undertaking.
Which is what, as you know, within the Hebrew community, every year they tell the story. We do it within Christianity. We keep telling the story of a resurrection. We keep telling the story of a crucifixion. We tell why Jesus' birth was an immaculate conception. But we at the same time need to see that our birth was immaculately conceived, because the same God that gave him birth is the same God that gave us birth. According to Psalm 139, when we were substance in our mother's womb, behold, God was there. So we have to take this scripture and make it alive and fresh and new for today's generation, because they're in agony. Anytime you have young people walking around with Malcolm X on their caps, it's because they're trying to reach into something and someone that will give them a good rap, and the church has a responsibility now to give them a map. Because you can have all the rap you want if you don't have a map to get out the mess.
That was my next question. With nowadays everything being so visual, you know, our attention is so easily diverted. Youth, I should say, their attention is so easily diverted. What do you have set up in your churches, or what do you see as a pattern established in churches that they use to reach the youth?
Well, it's interesting that you would ask that question, TR, because that points to the tension that is present in a number of black churches. The tension of coming to grips with the challenges of these times. And I said that to simply say this. We have available to us now a variety of different forms of media which are easily accessible to the average church for training and teaching, for instruction. And many of these types of media young people gravitate to because they're visual media. I think the church has an opportunity here where it can capitalize on some of these types of media for the purpose of reaching our young people. And for example, a number of the video shows and video programs are things that can be used in the local church to reach young people, to become the basis for conversation with them. It might just be that a number of the older Christians would not appreciate some of these things, and that's fine. But they can be used as the launching pad for conversation. And never mind the fact the young people would then come to be a part of that kind of atmosphere. So I am seeing that there are a number of different kinds of opportunities that are available to the church in this connection.
Yeah, I think the church needs to change its modus operandi. It's tragic that some churches have 7 people, 60, 70 years of age, controlling 1,000 folk. I mean, that's just sick. You're talking about we've been doing it this way.
May I add, Reverend, 7 people, many of whom haven't gone past an elementary school education, managing multi-million-dollar complexes and making decisions for thousands of people.
Right. But the problem is the thousands of people allow that to happen.
Yes, and that's a tragedy.
And that comes into play too as a responsibility of a church member, because a lot of times church members may not feel, okay, with situation, the scenario that you're creating, a lot of times they feel that they are voiceless as to situations like that. Okay, well, this guy's been here for, for this amount of time, but he doesn't seem to be in tune to what our needs are. So what's the next step? It's good to sit there and say something about it, but then what can you do?
Well, let me push the process. See, when you got 7 Negroes trying to make a decision for 1,000 folk, we in trouble. And part of the reason is it's a European model.
Precisely.
President Bush is trying to decide for all of us. I got into our churches and churches across the city are doing casino gambling. We're against casino gambling, and we're doing a referendum. But it grew out of the fact that I heard daily on Calloway's show say that Calloway asked him, well, why don't you take it to the people and do a referendum? Because we think it is a moral question. We think it ought to be a people's decision. He said, I'm the mayor. I don't have to decide that. Well, now he's talking about dictator. He's not talking about democracy, the wrong D. So we have moved across this city to get people to sign the petition to put it on the ballot for November. Because it's important that he learns that he just can't tear up Hedgewish because he wake up one morning talking about he want an airport. He just can't wake up one morning and say that he would like to have a gaming room off the lake, which will change the entire character of this particular city. Well, if you're tribal, which is what happens in these churches, if you're tribal, where you go just from your office on the 5th floor to Bridgeport, and you don't travel to Europe, you don't travel to Africa, you don't travel to the Caribbean, and you don't have an international affairs department within your city government, then you'll get a tribal mentality. And what happens in a lot of these churches, they have a tribal mentality where it's just us, it's a family church, and it's just our little small clique. Now, the way you get out of that, is that you have to go back to the African model of community, which simply says that in my church, personally, we try to meet at least once a month after church service. That's when most people are there. And if anyone has a proposition they want to bring to our church, they must present it to the church and convince the church. And then the people get a chance to talk, to decide, and then ultimately we say, how do you want to vote? Because they now got a piece of the action, so they must have now a piece of the responsibility. If you lock it up where 7 folk down in the basement make decision for 1,000 folk upstairs in the sanctuary, that's military.
And I want to make a comment too about this, Reverend, because this has always bothered me, and it does so increasingly in terms of the black church. Most of the time, these 7 folk are 7 older black men. And if you look across the average black congregation, it is supported primarily by women.
Well, that's because most of of these black churches operate off of what they call Pauline theology. Paul said, women be quiet in church. Paul said, if a man knows not how to rule his own house, how he gonna rule God's? And whenever you look at that, you'll always find everybody running to Paul. Now, don't nobody run to Jesus and look at what Jesus has said about his relationship.
Because if they did, they'd have to deal with Mary Magdalene.
That's the point. That's the point.
The woman of Samaria.
That's the point. And when you look at the amount of information about Jesus' relationship with women, and then you look at the amount of information about Paul's relationship with the women. Now, that grows out of the European mechanism bringing itself into the church. Slaves, be good to your master. Came out of Paul. In South Africa, we took a delegation. I was a part of a group of AME and CME ministers that went to South Africa, Namibia, and Angola. And it was interesting when we met with the South African theologians. They hung their hat on apartheid based on slaves be good to your master. Until I said to them, well, very well. Now tell me what Jesus said out of Isaiah 61, St. Luke 4:18, where he talked about release the captives because he didn't perpetuate the pattern of slavery. Because he said, no man is master. Don't call me master. We are all good, Rabboni. You know, none is good save God. You know. So the point is, when you start looking at what Jesus says, you get a liberation force. And when you look at Paul, what Paul says, you get the oppressive force. So now, here we are in 1992, where that kind of Sunday school mentality has fed itself down to a deacon who is still sitting on his power base. He's chairman of the board, but that's all he got is a chair on the board. He don't have the people. And it's the role of the preacher to accept him where he is, try to bring him where he ought to be, but meanwhile, create another mechanism where the people can decide about the vision. And it might mean after church service on Sunday. It might mean once a month town hall meetings where you let the people speak. It might mean a combination between the congregation and the community. It might mean once a month where the young people have a worship service, even if it ain't no more in the afternoon, and those 7 deacons don't show up in the afternoon. And you can then find out what is the role of children or young people in the church. You might have to take young people away on a retreat where they just, or you might want to have a dance where they dance for the Lord. They dance for 2 hours, but they talk for 4. Because you've got a panel of people who from the church are social workers who need to hear. Might be some pastoral counseling people who need to hear young people. You might have to have a young people's conference. So there's more than one way to skin a cat, as the old folks used to say.
What I hear you saying, Reverend, is this, that we need to broaden our leadership base. And we need to risk some creative kinds of innovations that makes possible an infusion of new blood within the leadership structure of the church. And that sometimes means some creative risk-taking.
Except the only thing you have to...
We have to be willing to run that risk.
Right.
My comment, though, in this connection is that this risk has to take place within the context of a moral boundary condition already given in the scriptures.
Yeah, but the only thing you have to watch is what we call internalization. That if you keep turning people into the church versus turning them out to the church, then you create a tension that might not be creative. It might end up being negative. There is more room on the outside than what there is on the inside. That a Sunday morning church can be held down at the lake, down at Lake Michigan.
Yes.
You can have a young people's sunrise service, which ain't got nothing to do with the 7 folk, because they ain't getting up that early. You know what I'm saying? Or you can have a midnight service. You can have a Saturday Night Live at your church. So my point is, it isn't the church, the building. It is not the real estate, but the estate of your reality. It isn't so much working on the moral piece, because you are what you are. The woman who committed adultery wasn't moral. I mean, till after she got into the dialogue with Jesus.
Yes.
So you accept people where they are, And it ain't too important if they're moral while they're working.
Yes.
Their conversion might occur while they're inside the work.
Yes.
Or after the retreat.
Yes.
So they might go to the retreat immoral.
As was the case with Samuel, for example. He was a number of years in the temple serving with Eli before he was even called or before he even had a knowledge of God.
That's my point.
And so your point is quite well taken.
And that's important because sometimes we get into this high, lofty, only us.
Yes.
Anarchy type of thing. It's good that you said that because, like I said, a lot of people that are members of the church don't realize, they think that their only responsibility is to tithe, you know, and then outside of that, you know, nothing else gets done. But they don't realize that when you do things, just as you both have mentioned, then not only does it make it a better church, but more people want to come to it. It makes it more noticeable in the community because people are like, well, hey, I'm very involved in the church. This is what we do. You know, people are, like I said, people are they get in tune to not necessarily what a preacher tells them, but by word of mouth from other members to come in. I think that's important.
Yeah, when you look at the birth of Martin King, who comes from a father, a grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, right? Of pastors, okay? But he's the only one that really broke out of the pack after going through all of those other generations, to the point that he started moving with what my preacher calls the social gospel. Now, when you look at his life and the fact that he then surrounds himself with other preachers who were doing the same thing, all of us, by the time we got to Atlanta, I came out of North Carolina during the sit-ins. Jim Bevel came out of Nashville, Tennessee with Reverend C.T. Vivian. Jesse Jackson came out of North Carolina. Andrew Young came out of Georgia. Bernard Lee came out of Alabama. So by the time when we got to the table, Ralph Abernathy came out of Alabama. When we got to the table, we had already been to jail. We had already picketed. You know what I mean? We were seasoned warriors within our understanding of our theology. So when he convenes the first meeting, he's not convening some folk who don't know what time of day it is. He's convening some people who've already done some experiments on how to create social change. Now, my point is this, that a black preacher has a responsibility because he's the most freest person in the society, because people pay his salary. See, my congregation pays my salary for me to be free enough to do everything that I do, because they can't go to the meetings and get the information on when the community block grant dollars are coming. It's my responsibility to find that out. It's my responsibility to say to corporations, you have to hire young people. You got to put money in black banks. It's my responsibility to work with Carol Mosley Braun and make sure that every person who is of good thinking and goodwill votes for her, regardless of their color, their denomination, or their condition.
That's one of the, and we don't have much time left, but I wanted to both ask you this. Now, usually around political season, it's so common, especially in the black community, to see political candidates running for office come to the church and speaking to the different congregations in the community that they're running for. Now, what I'm getting from you is that you feel that it is important that these leaders or candidates stay in tune with the church members?
Yes, see, I have two criteria.
Well, a mix of
I have two
politics
criteria.
and church.
Black politicians got to be in somebody's church. That's the first question. They say, well, Reverend, can I come to your church? I say, who church you belong to now? If you don't belong to anybody's church, go get you a church. Then come back and see me. Okay? So Carol Mosley Braun comes out of Claude Wyatt's church. Gene Sawyer comes out of Claude Wyatt's church. Danny Davis comes out of New Galilee on the west side. So most of them, Roland Burris, as you know, comes out of St. John Baptist Church. So that's the first thing. For white politicians, I asked them to give me the list of the church that they belong to so that I can send black politicians to their white churches. Because what traditionally happens is white politicians get carte blanche into black churches, but black politicians don't get the quid pro quo of going into white churches.
What do you say to that, Dr. Leon?
I agree with Pastor Sampson. Not only should black politicians be church members, black politicians should have an ongoing relationship with their church. And they should declare that relationship, because that's a form of mentoring and role modeling.
That's correct.
You don't simply show up at the time when it's campaign time and disappear. but you have a continued relationship with that local pastor so that the local pastor can have access to information and help that will help to build a community. And I think that Pastor Sampson is quite on target with that comment.
Okay, I want to thank you both for coming to the program. This is a very interesting conversation. I had a list of questions here that I really didn't get to because the conversation was so interesting. But I'd like to thank you and take this opportunity now to invite you back again.
Thank you.
Promise.
Yes. Okay.
Promise.
Okay.
Promise. Thank you for the opportunity.
It is now that time in our program when we recommend a book for the month. The book that we recommend is called The Challenge of the Congo, and it is by it's by Kwame Nkrumah. I can never say that name right. But anyway, it is a book about the political struggles that have happened in that country. Reading is very good for you, and we encourage you to do that. On behalf of all of us here at Here We Are, we'd like to thank you for tuning in. And as always, until the next time, God bless.